Hello, it's time for another episode of Discipleship Today. My name is Bob Benson. I'm the pastor of Christ Lutheran Church out in Greenhurst, New York. Our address is actually Bemis Point. I've been using the book of John as a text for discipleship. There was a special relationship that Jesus and John had together. John called himself the beloved disciple. We think John was one of the youngest disciples, maybe not much more than a teenager, 14, maybe 15 years old. And there was this connection between John and Jesus. And so what we see in the book of John is a very different record of the events through the Gospels. It's not one of the synoptic Gospels. 85% of what we read in John is different than it is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We're in John 9. And I'm going to read a small portion in the beginning of John 9, and then this will be a continuation. Our next episode, we're going to talk about the rest of this section. I'm going to be reading from the ESV, and I'm going to start in verse 1. As he passed by, he saw a blind man from birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud, and he said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is this not the man that used to sit and beg?" And some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but it is like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." So they said to him, "Then how were your eyes open?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, I washed, and I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But the others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" And there was division among them. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes?" He said, "He is a prophet." I'm going to stop there. That's verse 17, and we're going to cover this first section. Initially, in these first 17 verses, we get this sense. We have to put it into context. Jesus had just had a conflict in the temple with the Pharisees and Sadducees in the last part of chapter 8. And then we run into this in chapter 9. And there's a whole bunch of questions that come to mind. It's his disciples that ask him this question: who sinned, his parents or this man? And it says he was born blind. It records specifically there that he was born blind. My questions are, what did they believe? Did they believe in some kind of reincarnation, that this man could have sinned before he was born? And I think Jesus straightens that all out. It's not that this man sinned or that his parents sinned. This was done just so that God's power could be shown in the world. And what a perfect example for us. Having said these things, he spit on the ground. And that's in verse 6. And I wanted to highlight something that I saw some time ago. There's some Jewish scholars who believe that this was a creative miracle, that this man was born without eyeballs. And since we are formed of the dust of the ground, Jesus was doing a creative miracle with his own spittle and the raw material that God used. God used the dust of the ground to make man. And that when he washed, there were new eyes in the sockets. I don't know, there's no biblical support for that, but I think that's a really interesting concept, that this was a creative miracle, because Jesus was there at the beginning of creation. He said, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. Two different words there. And I think that's part of it. What a great thing that this creative miracle, and all of a sudden the Pharisees and the Sadducees are upset because why? Because this happened on the Sabbath day. This man doesn't keep the Sabbath. How can a sinner do these things? And in that, they had the answer to their question. This man was not a sinner, and he could do these things. But I don't think it matters whether you're a sinner or not. Were Peter and John sinners? Yeah, and they healed people. Are we sinners? Yeah, and sometimes we see healing. There's just this power that we see through this whole thing. And that was John's point of writing this whole book, was so that we would see the divinity, the God portion of Jesus Christ. And that was the whole reason that he wrote these things down. And he highlights that fact through his gospel. And then there's still this conflict that's going on between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and Jesus. And that's the background that this comes from. And we're going to see that throughout the rest of the book of John, that this conflict increases and reaches a crescendo at the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So for Discipleship Today, my name is Pastor Bob Benson. Thank you for spending some time listening to me today.